Hello, and welcome everybody to today's AMR discussion webinar on the roles of different actors, such as the private industry, public sector, and not-for-profits, in developing new treatments for drug-resistant infections. The AMR discussions are still a rather new format by GARD-P's Scientific Affairs team, and it aims to provide a platform for discussions of various topics related to AMR. We held our first webinar of this series in July of this year, and now we are very happy to have our second one in collaboration with WHO on the occasion of World Antimicrobial Awareness Week 2021. Just like our other webinars, the Revive webinars, the AMR discussion webinars are recorded and are made available on our website, revive.gardp.org/webinars. Today's recording will be available in the course of next week. On our website, you also find announcements of our future webinars. For example, we will soon provide information and a registration link for our first 2022 webinar, which will be about target candidate profiles and target product profiles for new antimicrobials. Approximately the last 15 minutes of this webinar will be dedicated to the audience Q&A, but you can send your questions at any time during the webinar in the questions window in your webinar control panel. And please, if possible, include the name of the person to whom your question is addressed. We will do our best to discuss as many questions as possible at the end of the webinar. So before I now go ahead to invite and welcome our panelists, I will show a short video in which the speakers will introduce themselves. This video will take about 3 minutes. I apologize if for some people this doesn't play very well due to bandwidth issues. If this happens to you, please just stay on the line, and once the video is finished, everything should be working again for you.
Hi everyone, my name is Onyebuchi Chukwu. I am a professor of orthopedic surgery at the Ekwueme Federal University, Ndufu, Alike, Nigeria. I am a fellow of the West African College of Surgeons, a fellow of the American College of Surgeons, and also a fellow of the International College of Surgeons. I am a former chief medical director of the Ebonyi State University Teaching Hospital in Abakaliki, Nigeria. I was the Minister of Health of the Federal Republic of Nigeria from April 2010 to October 2014. I served as a board member of the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria from 2013 to 2016. I am presently a member of the United Nations One Health Global Leaders Group on antimicrobial resistance, and I'm a co-leader of the Nigeria National Antimicrobial Resistance Antimicrobial Usage Committee of Practice. I am delighted to be a panelist on this webinar.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. I am Fernandes. I have no immediate affiliation to any company or university. I have, however, spent about 40 years of my life in major pharma as well as in biotech. In major pharma, I have worked for about 27 years at Squibb, Abbott, and Bristol Squibb. These were the heydays of antibiotics when I worked there, and I had the privilege of working on aztreonam, fidaxomicin, clarithromycin, tosufloxacin, difloxacin, tamifloxacin, and others. Since my retirement as vice president at Bristol Squibb in 1997, I have been CEO of 3 biotech companies and an entrepreneur. At Cempra, my last company, I developed solithromycin and fusidic acid and retired in December of 2016. I'm still passionate about antibiotics and work on the National Biodefense and other organizations right now and sit on 6 company boards. Am I retired? Maybe not. but I am passionate about antibiotic development. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Rohit Malpani. I studied law in the United States and worked as a technology lawyer in Silicon Valley before deciding to pursue a career in international health and human rights. For over a decade, I worked on the issue of access to affordable medicines, including with Oxfam and Médecins Sans Frontières. I'm now a consultant based in Paris. I work with the Global Antibiotic Research and Development Partnership, but more generally continue to work on issues of access to medicines, antibiotic resistance, and the use of artificial intelligence for health. I also represent non-governmental organizations on the board of UNITAID.
All right, so I would like now to welcome all the speakers. Please switch on your cameras and your microphones. And a very warm welcome to our moderator, Peter Beyer, who is a senior advisor at the AMR division at WHO. Thank you to the four of you for contributing to this webinar, and enjoy.
Thank you so much, Astrid, for organizing this, and welcome to the panelists. And I was very impressed what I saw in the video. Thank you so much. To the audience, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. So welcome to this seminar on the roles of different actors in developing new treatments for drug-resistant infections. As Astrid said, this is part of the World Antimicrobial Awareness Week, and we are raising awareness during this week about the threat of antimicrobial resistance. And one of the aspects is that with the increasing resistance, existing antibiotics are becoming not effective anymore. They're losing their effectiveness. That means that we do need a steady supply of new antibiotics. So we have to invest in research and development of new treatments that are that are active against resistant bacteria. And this, unfortunately, has become an area of pharmaceutical research and development which is not very profitable. And we can dig into this question later today. And it is also very scientifically challenging. Prabha has said this in her video. She worked in the big companies in antibiotic development in the heydays when they were developing many new antibiotics. But for the past years, not many new innovative antibiotics have reached the market. And so I would like to start the discussion with Professor Chukwu, because we have seen how important it is in the COVID-19 pandemic, how important it is to have a diverse production and also research base. So what can you tell us from Nigeria about what can the different actors do, industry, public sector, and how should they work together to make this happen?
Thank you, Peter. First thing is that it is the responsibility of government and its agencies to secure the health of the people in each country. So in Nigeria, it is the responsibility of both the federal and the subnational governments to set the agenda, to ensure that medications, medicines are available and accessible. So policy formulation is the first thing. Legislation is another. And of course, it is the job of government to coordinate all the other actors, to decide. So the Federal Ministry of Health, along with its agencies, are quite central in Nigeria to driving the agenda. And then, of course, the government in Nigeria has a number of research institutes. We have the School Research Institute, we have the Medical Research Institutes. So all these agencies all support the function of government. Of course, the industry itself primarily basically is there to make profit, but in exchange for service. So they give value to the people by producing pharmaceuticals, but at the same time, like you mentioned earlier, they will not go to areas where they can make profit. So it is then the job of government to ensure that policies are made that will make the market quite friendly for the pharmaceutical industry. So government needs to be part of funding mechanisms, as it were. And then for the non-governmental organization, the civil societies, they are there like the conscience
of all this. So advocacy is number one. Monitoring, evaluation, all of them, it is the job. And of course, many of them now, foundations are available in Nigeria. We have a few millionaires who are now beginning to contribute money to fund research and to support what government is doing along with the industry.
Thank you very much, Professor Chukwu. And I've seen I think in your biography, when you were Minister of Health in Nigeria, you also really, you put a focus on working with your local industry to make them meet GMP standards, which I think is probably a key aspect of making this also an export-oriented industry.
Yeah, very true.
Prabha, you're the one, as you said, you ran 3 biotech companies yourself who were engaged in antibiotic drug development. You were with BMS as the vice president. Why were you able to develop antibiotics back then, and now it has become so difficult?
So, large pharma had made huge investments, absolutely huge investments since the early 60s to 70s, till about 1995. And why did it slow down is the question. They slowed down because there was a lot of action on stewardship, and people were starting to regulate how much antibiotic could be used out there. On top of that, regulations came out with limiting the amount of commercialization, letting it be used for limited indications, for fewer patients, and so on. But in the same time, clinical trials became increasingly expensive. So big pharma decided the profit margins were very low and decided to get out. Now, more recently though, large pharma has been thinking of getting back in. There have been investments made in CRISPR, antibodies, and other biologics. So, there you could treat fewer patients, maybe charge higher numbers, and still be profitable. Now, if you look at the small biotech companies, they're carrying the baton now of discovering new drugs. Some of them are discovering against the same old targets, which we all know about. Others are picking completely novel targets and new approaches, and those are very high risk because they have high risk of failures over there. Many of them are still working on beta-lactamase inhibitors, and they have a lower risk of failure. And recently, we have seen that there has been a focus on developing oral antibiotics. Now, when it becomes orally bioavailable, and if it becomes available in the community, we might be back to the good old days where it gets misused out there. So we have to be very careful about stewardship when it becomes orally bioavailable. Now, we haven't seen any commercial successes yet in the biotech sector. We hope it'll be there, though, with all the push-pull mechanisms which are in place. So hopefully those companies have a chance, but it's still a hope, and we'll see how it goes.
Thank you so much, Prabha, for this insight from the industry perspective. And I think it indeed, we had just a look at the successes of reduction of consumption of antibiotics in the veterinary sector in some European countries. For example, I looked at the numbers in Germany, where they went down from 1,700 tons that they were using in food-producing animals to 700 tons over 10 years. And still, people say they use too much. But it's clear for the industry, the market went down from 1,700 tons in terms of volume to 700 tons. So it is a drastically shrinking market with the profit margins not necessarily expanding. Rohit, you are an expert. You have been working on different models of developing new treatments for different diseases for a long time with Doctors Without Borders, as you said, with Oxfam, and you wrote recently also a report for REACT, which is one of the most active NGOs in antimicrobial resistance, on the current research and development scheme and what should be changed and what is who should play which role? So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, and also recently written a different paper looking at the role of not-for-profits, which I'll also try to focus on. So I think, you know, as Prabha was noting, in the mid-1990s, part of the challenge was not only the fact that returns had dropped substantially, both because the science was harder and because of the need for appropriate use, but also that we hadn't really developed a different way of incentivizing the development of new antibiotics. We really were just stuck with one system. And so we've seen this gradual deterioration, of course, over the last 25 years, and we're sort of trying to steer the ship in a new direction. So I think we have to start with the premise that, you know, simply leaving development to the market is not going to allow us to reach our objectives. And I think we also have to sort of let go of any notion that, you know, how development should be done and what role each sector should play. That it really needs to be done on a case-by-case basis in terms of each product. I agree with Dr. Chukwu in terms of, you know, what the role of governments in the public sector is, especially with the World Health Organization, which is really to identify and set priorities for drug development and ensuring timely access. And this is especially to ensure that the antibiotics that we determine are really reflecting the actual public health need. And we know that with the current antibiotics market, that the public sector is going to be responsible for the lion's share of funding, whether it's push funding, whether it's going to be eventually through reimbursement mechanisms which emerge or through pull incentives which are being discussed. And so, you know, again, if the public sector is ultimately paying for all of the stages of research and development and guaranteeing a market, it also needs to be clear what, you know, what they want to require. I think with the private sector, and also to sort of echo with what was just being said, we're really talking about small to medium-sized companies that are funded by entities such as CARB-X and which at times are using publicly funded research or developing their own, and which are really sort of at this stage reaching sort of the middle development of new compounds. And as we're seeing, the struggle for these companies has been to sort of complete late-stage development and ensuring that these products are commercially viable. So this is really where, again, the role of not-for-profit actors becomes very important, because they can play a role throughout the entire life cycle development and access to new antibiotics. You know, they can conduct trials through mid and late stage development. They can ensure that we are getting trials, especially in geographies that otherwise are being neglected and ignored. And I think most crucially in ensuring access in low and middle income countries, but even in higher income countries, whether it's through licensing, production, registration, and also the development of guidelines to ensure sustainable use and also ensuring supply. As we know, there's many challenges with shortages today around the world. And again, I think the other quality that not-for-profits bring is being able to sort of act without having commercial objectives being the sort of first stopping point in terms of how decisions are being made. Thanks.
Thank you, Rohit, and thank you for bringing up this not-for-profit model, and that is specifically why WHO and DNDi, the Drugs for Neglected Disease Initiative, have partnered in 2014 to set up GARD-P, where Prabha is the chair of the Scientific Advisory Committee, and GARD-P is a not-for-profit drug developer and is following the priority setting of WHO and tries to develop treatments that address specific public health needs globally and not only in those markets which are attractive financially. And we have seen that with COVID-19, that maybe not-for-profit drug development would be really important to ensure better pandemic preparedness. What do you think, Professor Chukwu? I mean, what are the lessons learned from COVID experience and from the African perspective, in particular, the Nigerian perspective, on how can we ensure that that there is equitable access to new treatments and new antibiotics as well?
Thank you, Peter. Well, with COVID, the initial challenge for many of the countries in Africa and Nigeria was there was just no vaccine available. And so the country had to depend more on non-masco interventions. And then when the issue of vaccination came up, it was clear that the cost was very prohibitive. They just couldn't afford, and many of these countries have large populations. And so that now required some kind of mechanism, and the WHO and other bodies now incorporated, to introduce mechanisms for making this available. But even at that, there was a problem of supply. The supply chain was just, of course, as you know, COVID chain destroyed so many things, including the supply chain. And even for the companies, it was difficult for them to meet up with the demand. So what the lesson is, we just have to find ways of being ready. And the only way we can be ready is to build capacity, not only in the advanced countries, but also in the developing world. That capacity will require a lot of funding, but funding is not the only major issue. It requires skills. You need to build companies, country-based companies that have the know-how to be able to produce this. Then you also need to build up the research institutes because in the long run, what will be cheaper for each country is to be able to come out with local innovations that will be relatively cheap for them rather than depending on imported medications and vaccines. So the challenge we got from COVID was clear, but I'm not even too sure. We know about the lessons, but whether we've learned the lessons is a different matter. I doubt whether we've learned, any lessons yet.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I mean, Nigeria, you are in a good position because you do have a strong local pharmaceutical industry that is capable of doing producing small molecules. So maybe the new antiviral treatments that are developed now by a couple of companies, there's Molnupiravir and the new product that was developed by Pfizer. Maybe these products are opportunities also for your local industry.
Yeah. There are opportunities for local industry, but there are problems in there. One of the problems is the source of raw materials. Nigeria, for instance, unlike countries like India, still depend on a lot of importation for the raw materials. So the industries are there, and the problem is the exchange rate. So you're going to produce and sell in the local currency, but when you're importing in dollars or euro. And so as long as the local currency keep depreciating, it doesn't make business sense for many of these companies. So that's part of the problem.
Yeah, thank you so much for highlighting this importance of production of active pharmaceutical ingredients, which is concentrated, as you said, in India and China, which is a challenge, even if you do have local industry. What do you think, Rohit, not-for-profit drug development? As you said, GARDP is doing the R&D, but then there's the production. So how can we make this more equitable and broaden the production base as well?
Well, I think if we start with the premise of looking at the pandemic, we have to recognize that the so-called machinery that has been established over the last 2 decades, especially in response to HIV and AIDS and also associated diseases, is not working and really it's broken. And so some of this is not only about what we can do in the current moment, but looking backwards at sort of the assumptions we made around how we sort of ensure access and what is going to have to change going forward to make sure that the same outcomes that countries like Nigeria and others have faced are not repeated. Now, as it relates to not-for-profits, I think there's a number of steps that have to occur before we can think about the role that not-for-profits have to play. I agree with Dr. Chukwu in terms of investing in research institutes, and that really is a question of investing in preparedness. So, for example, with COVID-19, if there had been sufficient investment with prior coronavirus outbreaks, we would have seen, perhaps much more preparation in terms of having either platforms or drugs available at an earlier stage of the pandemic. So certainly, and I think especially having this research being concentrated in low and middle income countries is critical to ensure that we not only have equitable production ultimately of products, but also the equitable production of knowledge and distribution of knowledge around the world. We certainly need to see from a not-for-profit perspective, not-for-profits can only succeed if we truly have collaboration and cooperation, and that is something that we haven't seen in the pandemic. We have seen often a one-way approach towards, often the public sector and arguably the World Health Organization and others facilitating the development of these technologies, but not necessarily the production and the sharing of knowledge in a way that is collaborative and cooperative. So that really needs to occur across the board on an end-to-end basis, and that's really what ensures not-for-profit partnerships can succeed. We have to recognize that the current incentives that we have for developing new products are not adequate, and this is certainly something that we're talking about with antibiotics, but this is also something that matters for pandemics. We should not confuse the commercial viability of pandemic products during a pandemic with what existed prior to the pandemic. So unless we recognize that those incentives were not sufficient to develop these products, then not-for-profits ultimately cannot work in collaboration with others to use the science and knowledge to develop the products we need on an equitable basis. And ultimately, not-for-profits are their bottom line is to ensure that we have equitable access to these technologies. And that again requires a range of policy measures and interventions and cooperation to ensure that these technologies can be produced equitably and distributed equitably without barriers to their use around the world.
Yeah, thank you so much. And after the big Ebola outbreak in West Africa, WHO developed the R&D blueprint, we call it, and we systematically identified the pathogens where we had similar issues, where we knew they had pandemic potential, but we had no drugs, no diagnostics, no vaccines. And so we made this list, and that is when CEPI was set up to be basically the agency that should ensure that for each of these pathogens, they would develop either treatment or vaccine up to phase 2, because it's not possible to do clinical trials when there is no outbreak, when the disease is practically absent. And this was fairly successful, but I remember, Rohit, when I mean, your board member and WHO as well, one of the things where I think the governments of the developed countries who gave money to industry in this pandemic failed is that they did not follow through in their contracts in giving the companies appropriate obligations to share the outcomes. And that is tedious. And unfortunately, many governments don't seem to go that far. And we know this from DNDi, we know this from GARD-P. It is when you enter into collaboration that you have to fix it in your contracts. You can't fix it later. That we see now in the discussion with the companies. Later, when the product is on the market, there are 1,000 reasons why you will not distribute it equitably. And that I hope that governments will learn from this experience.
And just quickly on that's not a technical or legal matter. We often tend to reduce it to being something that's just a technical fix. It's a political matter. It's a political will. And it's not only a question of high-income country governments, for example, that are on the board of CEPI, but it is also the inclusion of low and middle-income country governments that can make those demands and that can ultimately preserve their interests also in these discussions. That is what's lacking in a lot of these structures. Sorry.
Yes. No, you're welcome. Prabha, yes, please.
Just a point on the COVID, in addition to everything which was said, a couple of things which have come out since the COVID pandemic has started. One is that infections can start in poorer countries, lower middle countries, and spread here. That awareness is out there in all governments of the world, including the Western governments. So now we are looking to see how we can block diseases which can start over there. So there will be investments in that. The next part is diagnostics. How can we quickly do surveillance and diagnostics? That is a missing piece. And that is also expensive. It's not inexpensive to do these rapid diagnostics. So that also requires investments, perhaps from the Western countries into the lower middle countries. So, both of those are missing pieces. Then the third one is manufacturing. We just talked about manufacturing. I've been heavily involved with antibiotic manufacturing, and it's all related to volume. It's related to volume. Once you need to make large volumes, you can't kind of come up with a better process to make it, and everything kind of starts to fall in prices. And that's why it's so important to invest in those manufacturing facilities in every country. Every country is going to need their own manufacturing, including the US. It cannot be imported all the time from there. And the last one is the influence of government and regulations. What we saw here, Trump had called it warp speed, but it was already in place. The government can lift some of those regulations and make it easier for the companies to get approval. And for antibiotics, there is no reason why we need to spend so much money in getting a regular approval first. You know, why not get something like an EUA approval, move it faster with government help, and then monitor it, so then you get the full BLA approval so companies can put up their own ads and sell. So that would help a whole lot. Those were some of the lessons we've learned from COVID.
Thank you, Prabha. On the last point, the regulatory aspect. So your suggestion, I mean, your view is that the current regulatory environment is not conducive enough and too costly for allowing companies to put new products on the market?
Yes, it's terrible actually. So it's very unrealistic. You know, it's easy for statisticians to sit down and design a trial. It's not realistic. So, you know, we do non-inferiority trials for both the United States and in Europe. And these are against currently available drugs, against bacteria which are susceptible, because currently available drugs don't work against the resistant strains. And you get these non-inferiority margins and you approve the drug. Now, you know, no one is going to pay a lot of money for a new drug when the old one works just as well, which is the kind of the non-inferiority margins, right? So currently, some of the biotech companies are running trials to show superiority over existing drugs, and that's very helpful. But if you look at the last approved drug, cefdiercol from Shionogi, it's approved in the US and the EMA. And, you know, discussions are going on, and hopefully it will get approved in other countries. But just getting it approved in the Western countries using these non-inferiority margins is a no-win at all. And also, you know, if you have a completely new product, a completely new chemical entity, there's higher risk in that. There's much higher risk than doing another beta-lactamase inhibitor. Who is going to take that risk? And then will there be a better reward, you know, this push and pull incentives? Will there be a better incentive if you develop a completely new compound and a new target? That's where we've got to focus on, because just developing another beta-lactamase inhibitor, you know, you're going to get resistance. It's a battle we're going to lose.
Yes, you said this before. This is the challenge of either you do something which is well established, but it's not going to be a game changer, but you know you can do it, or you venture into something which is really new, a new target, a new mode of action, and then your risk of failure is bigger, and also what you need to prove in terms of safety and efficacy. We do hope, of course, with the African Regulatory Agency that now has been, I think the treaty has been ratified by a sufficient number of countries, and it entered into force, that this would lead to more harmonization in Africa and make it easier also to get approval outside. As you said, this new drug, cefdiercol, you mentioned, is only approved in the US and in Europe, and it's typical, and the company is not going probably much further than that. And that deprives majority of the population, the global population, of access to this product. But Prabha, maybe to pick up on this, because I know you, GARP, you signed an agreement with Shionogi, and you are working with other companies as well. How do you envisage this, you know, to make these products accessible?
So, you know, we talked about regulations, right? So not only is the problem with these regulatory bodies is that it's the standard 3 or 4 indications. So you do HAPVAP, you do skin, and you do complicated urinary tract infections, and you put it out there. And then you do it against bugs, bacteria, which are present in Europe. But this is not the pattern. We have seen through the GARP database that the patterns of resistance is different from even different cities in India, in Africa, in China. They're very different. And we have no data on these new drugs against those resistant strains. So what GARP will do, you know, will be able to, or most public-private partnerships can do this, is if you have trial centers elsewhere, get the data in all these countries, show what works there, get some real life data on treating real life patients without, you know, clouding it with these non-inferiority trials, you will expand the patient population. Secondly, you know, you'll start pediatric trials. You know, children, as we all know, get sick all the time. You know, they get exposed to other children, they're a little dirty, and they get infected, and they need antibiotics. And, you know, when we have the new ones, of course, you want your child to be treated with the best drug. They're not available there. So, you know, GARD-P will do pediatric trials. They will also do indications like sepsis, for which there is no real guidance. So they can do sepsis trials, they can do gonorrhea studies, and expand not only the access to the whole world and not just the European Union and America, but expand it to the whole world where the drug is actually needed and get additional indications. So this is like the domino thing, right? So you'll increase the access, increase the number of patients, not because you're going to give it away willy-nilly, but with stewardship to those patients who need it. So then, however, you still not need to manufacture a whole lot more. So this way, the manufacturing amount increases, the cost decreases, and then the diagnostics will then step in too. So rapid diagnostics is also expensive to develop. Nobody wants to develop it for 10 patients. So what you want to do is to develop it for the whole world. So you need rapid diagnostics to couple, especially with some of these new targets, and you want to show that that particular bacteria is still susceptible, so you use the antibiotic right. So it's a domino effect. So if you increase access to so many different countries, different patient populations where there is a need, it will all work out. That's my real belief. That's the only way it can work out.
Thank you so much, Prabha. And I followed the work of GARD-P, and it's true. I mean, we very much welcome that GARD-P has clinical trial centers in South Africa, in Thailand, in Kenya, in India. You are able to, GARD-P is able to conduct these trials, and that is, of course, also capacity building. Professor Chukwu, what do you think from your perspective on this division of labor? I think Rohit raised a very good point that it's the institutions that were in, I mean, to do pandemic preparedness, like CEPI, it shouldn't be only an issue about the governments that provide the resources, and how can countries who basically are those who also need the products can be better involved in those institutions. And I know that you know, many of these institutions sit in Geneva, for example, in Europe, and not in Africa.
Following from the Ebola virus outbreak in West Africa, a lot of development has occurred, say, in Africa, for instance. Shortly before Ebola virus disease came out, I, as Minister of Health, had established, you know, with the aid of the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, we established a Nigeria Center for Disease Control, which played a major role in tackling the Ebola outbreak in Nigeria. But then the rest of Africa learned from that experience from Nigeria. Got visits from ECOWAS, got visits from the AU, and that's why today you not only have the African Centers for Disease Control, you now also have even one for the ECOWAS countries in West Africa. So those things are ways of building capacity. So coming back to the issue of antimicrobials, for instance, all the stakeholders need to sit down and ask, what is it in for each one of us? Whatever strategy, whatever tactics we're going to develop must be win-win for all the major groups. If government only thinks of, okay, like Prabha has just said, stewardship, that's not just going to work. But then we also know that it's important to have stewardship for these antimicrobials to continue to work for us. So what it means is that we must be able to look at what are the issues. For instance, when I was in Global Fund, we did the experimentation with ACTs, for instance, where Global Fund was supporting the industry to produce ACTs for malaria, and then being able to send these ACTs to countries where they were needed. But of course, we soon ran into problems. So it's good to learn lessons also from there. But I think the problem wasn't with the model as much as the commitment, the diligence that is required when you have this kind of arrangements. And just like Prada said, if you're not careful, before you know it, you'll be accusing each other of not sticking to the rules. So for me, I think it is possible. What is needed is political will, which of course, Rohit, I'm happy when you mention political will. It's the easiest thing to say, but it's the hardest thing to see happen. But political will can happen when the United Nations, for instance, continues to pile the pressure needed, when G7, for instance, continues to also pile pressures needed for many countries to come on board. So what I think really is that we need to work out what is win-win for all the groups. And what is going to be win-win for all the groups is for the pharmaceutical companies to make profit. There has to be a good margin for them. And then for the government to be able to have access to all these medicines for their people. And then for the non-for-profit to see this actually happening, because for them, they just want the social good. That is what they want. So let's think of working together, and I think it's possible.
So Peter,
Thank you so much. Yeah, Prabha.
Yes. So, it's very easy for politicians to respond to crisis. So, they put money in, they step up the activities, and then, just like when the Ebola thing went away, they took it away and they went on with something else, So the politicians respond to this sort of thing. So what we are trying to do, at least here in the United States, and I hope it's being done elsewhere, is to show that this infrastructure, this manufacturing, this need for antibiotics, the need for antibiotics, all this is in place at all times and cannot be changed when the pandemic is not there. That investment, and to show the economic benefit and the problem, it's now, because it's obvious in people's eyes right now, that in their minds, that there's a huge economic impact if they don't do it. So this is the time to show the people, show the countries, and it's up to us scientists, economists, to show the people that there is going to be an impact if we do not invest in it now, and it stays there at all times.
And I think this speaks, sorry, just to jump in, it speaks to the divergence we often have between something that has public health importance or economic importance versus what has commercial importance. And so I think the various investments that Prabhu was talking about that not-for-profits are often engaged in are really, again, they're not just about filling gaps. They're really about, focusing on the substance of what is required to have a viable system of pharmaceuticals and of antibiotics. So these are things that are of central importance to any government, central importance to any health system, but ultimately they are things that may not really sit within the remit of companies at a certain point. And therefore we need to find pragmatic solutions to ensure that we're fulfilling them.
Rohit, just to pick this up, can you give us an example of a good collaboration between private sector, public sector to make this happen?
Yeah, it's interesting. One thing that I thought about a lot, especially during the pandemic, is one of the earliest collaborations, which was the development of the meningitis A vaccine, which is now quite old and often repeated. But this involved the National Institutes of Health, which had a certain technology that it was willing to license out, a not-for-profit that was the meningitis vaccine project, which I think was hosted by PATH. And the Serum Institute of India, which today is now still the largest producer of vaccines, and it this included this, and it also included funding from the Gates Foundation and a commitment by the Serum Institute of India to produce the vaccine at no more than 40 cents a dose, as well as sort of the leadership and persistence of the individuals at the meningitis vaccine project who brought this to completion, and also worked to ensure that the vaccine was deployed alongside governments in the meningitis belt in West Africa. And I think this is important to think about, especially again, as we're thinking about the COVID pandemic, where we've had publicly funded technologies. And we should remember mRNA technologies have required 4 decades of publicly funded research. We've had publicly funded research and development in manufacturing, but we've had a very inequitable and poorly allocated deployment of vaccine, inadequate supplies, and a lot of avoidable morbidity and mortality. And so we have to keep these sort of distinct models in mind as when we do reach the end of COVID-19, because we are seeing here a failure of policy. We're seeing a failure of governance, and for me, it's a failure of decency ultimately to people who are being left behind. And I think these are important lessons as we're looking ahead to what is going to be a long and sustained challenge around drug-resistant infections.
You know,
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, sorry.
Peter, is that, you know, if every country is ready with manufacturing, maybe not this latest technology which has come out from either Oxford or from NIH, you know, when something like this happened, you know, I was at Abbott and return over was made. And so, you know, India simply decided, I'm going to make it. Whether you're going to be in conflict of the patent or not, I'm going to make it because my people need it. Africans need it. Indians need it. So they went ahead and made it. And yes, you know, they went to court and they kept making it. Who is going to now go after these companies? No one is really going to go after it. So if every country is ready with just modern equipment, modern technologies, when it happens, no matter where it happens, they can quickly make it. I think that should be the goal.
Yeah, and as you said, there need to be also a bit of a sufficient flexibility with the rules, because if it's a pandemic, then we have to mobilize globally manufacturing capabilities. I think there's a good example. I spoke recently with the German Ministry of Health, and now they are already tendering contracts where they want to reserve warm manufacturing capabilities. Basically, they want to pay companies to maintain production facilities they can use for their commercial products. But when there is a medical emergency, a pandemic, that then the government could use these production facilities. Basically, the company would then make them available for the government, and the government is paying them yearly fee for that. And I think that's a very good way of collaborating, because it's probably also more cost efficient than if they would set up a facility, a government-owned facility, which would have to produce in peacetime and compete with the private companies on the market, and to be then available in wartime. So, and Rohit, I like your example. Indeed, the meningitis A vaccine. The question is, why didn't we do so much more of this? Because it was successful, and there was as clear, as you said, there was a clear target product profile. What is the profile of the vaccine we want? What is the maximum cost? And that is, I think, also why it's so important to transfer also the new technologies like the mRNA to manufacturers, to research centers in Africa, and we are engaging with South Africa on this. I'm turning to the questions we got, and I think there's one which is really important, because somebody asked about, besides a functional market, we need to ensure that the scientific and medical expertise are maintained in the system. What can we do to make this space attractive for young scientists?
So, you know, I could think of it, you know, just from personal experience, these things are cyclical. Even when I went in for my PhD, you know, almost half a century ago, my PhD advisor asked me, the chairperson of the department asked me, why do you want to get into this space? It's dying. They've got antibiotics to cure all these things. And I said, it's gone back, and we got in. And again, you know, the same thing happened in the 80s. There was no interest in it. Companies were leaving the space even in the 80s. The quinolones happened, everybody jumped back in. So if there's a success, we might actually make it come back. Now, the fundamental biology in microbiology is going to stay important, whether it's bacteria, viruses, fungi, it's going to stay important. So I would advise new scientists to get in there, because microbes are not going away anywhere. They were there before us, they're going to be there after us.
Thank you, Prabha. There is another question also to you, Prabha. Combinations of repurposed drugs can potentially treat highly resistant bacteria at low cost. Do these combinations have a role in pandemic preparedness?
Indeed, they do. And repurposing old drugs is very useful in the pandemic. You know, we did for remdesivir, we've done that for dexamethasone for this COVID pandemic. Even the protease inhibitor from Pfizer, started with other viruses and was then moved into this one. Wow. Molnupiravir was developed for influenza. And so, these are drugs which are being repurposed. Of course, there is. Now, combinations of old antibiotics will work against a large number of bacterial infections, but will not work against all of them. And remember, combinations for activity also bring combinations of adverse events. And when you combine something with, let's say, polymyxin or colistin, you could have renal damage or other damages. And so, it's better to have one entity so you limit the use of these antibiotics. But indeed, because of cost, people do use combinations. And GARP is very active in testing combinations, but doing it, at the right doses, because these are mostly arbitrarily picked at the old doses. So we need to actually see what is the right dose to be used in those combinations.
Yeah, thank you so much, Prabha, for that response. I have another question which I really like, because I mean, my area is R&D coordination, and yours as well, in particular, Prabha, and but obviously, and you spoke about neonatal sepsis, which is one of the big problems. And so the question is about, so why do we focus so much on drug development if maybe the investment in infection prevention and control should be the one aspect we should focus so much more in particular with respect to hospital-acquired infections? And that is, of course, a bit different than pandemic preparedness. But do you want to say something about it? I mean, any of the panelists, the focus on IPC?
So happy to say that, these are all two sides of the coin. You have to practice cleanliness, disinfection, appropriate use of antibiotics. And this is what will eventually allow these antibiotics to be used for a longer time, and lifting people from poverty, because much of the fact of these infections occurring because of bad health, lack of food, lack of nutrition, and of course, environmentally, not clean conditions. And so you have to uplift these areas.
I think, I mean, I looked up the numbers. MRSA, which was a big killer in hospitals in Europe and elsewhere some years ago, in Northern Europe, it was controlled by enhancing infection prevention and control. Yes, we also do have new drugs that work against methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, but the first line of defense is eliminating MRSA from your hospital, and it works.
That's correct, and you're seeing Candida auris now, an fungal, which is occurring in the same way, and infection control is what is controlling it, because most of the antifungals don't work.
And that is maybe also, in particular, Candida aureus, which is even more difficult to in terms of infection prevention control. That's maybe also where we need new innovation, how to ensure IPC.
Well, what we're doing for now is like having an insurance. Can you imagine if there was a situation where almost every infection had a vaccine? You wouldn't be there talking about antimicrobials. But we know in real life, it's not going to happen so soon. So there will always be instances where water and sanitation and personal hygiene is not what you want it to be like. There will still be instances where, because of the effect of wars, all kinds of civil strifes and so on, those kind of systems ultimately break down. People overcrowdedness, people living in camps, and of course the hygiene and sanitation is so poor. So that's why we continue to talk about having antimicrobials. But what is important is, as we are getting this insurance of having antimicrobials, effective antimicrobials that we could use whenever we have these infections, we'll continue on the journey of improving water, sanitation, and hygiene, continue on the journey of producing vaccines. It doesn't mean we're going to forget about them, but the insurance is important to have these antimicrobials.
You know,
just to jump in quickly, I mean, I agree, probably almost just two sides of the same coin. This is about trying to ensure that we are making investments that, again, it's very hard to see a commercial motive around these investments. Now, the World Bank has very clear studies that shows what are the economic consequences of not addressing drug-resistant infections today and the future. But again, it is getting out of the mindset that unless something can be a market, whether it's infection prevention and control, or we're talking about antibiotics for children, or we're talking about, again, antibiotics that we want to hold in reserve till a future time, that we are seeing the right levels of public investment and private investment to ensure that we can meet these needs.
You know, there's a changing patient population also in almost the whole world, but there's an aging population. There are people who are getting transplants or immunosuppressed, cancer therapy. Well, they progress. We forget, you know, we're paying, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars for a cancer drug, but those patients could actually die from an infection. And if we can show that those resistant bugs are what are killing those patients, perhaps there would be a greater investment in that space.
Thank you so much. I think we're reaching the end. I'm looking at the questions. I have a question on how low resource countries can do what they can do to obtain new antibiotics, because developers and funders need to get benefits. I think we partly touched upon this question. I wanted to highlight one initiative that we are working as WHO together with GARDP and UNICEF. We want to set up an antibiotic facility where countries can obtain new products that come to the market, are not registered outside Europe and the US. So we want to facilitate this access to countries so that they can also have the new antibiotics in their arsenal when it's needed, and also do the necessary follow-up studies. But I give the floor back to you with this question. So maybe if you want to have another minute for your closing remarks, and I start with Professor Chukwu.
Thank you, Peter. For me, I think we have to look at it as a system. We want to find what is sustainable. Sustainable for the industry, but then again, sustainable for each country in terms of funding. And we need to encourage each of the countries, particularly the low to medium income countries, to develop some kind of a health insurance scheme. That is what is going to help them, because government must support the industry. Government must ensure there's an uptake of whatever is produced by the industry. It is very important. We can't run away from it. Government must ensure that when these antibiotics, that not only takes a lot of funding to bring out, but takes a long time and so much skill to produce, because of that, the people producing them can be encouraged to do more. So I think moving forward, not only do we need that commitment, but more importantly, can we go back and ask, what is universal health coverage? And that's part of the key.
Thank you. Prabha, please.
So, you know, early stage discovery is really not that expensive. Even academic labs are currently doing it, and they are getting funded by partnerships with Wellcome Trust, with CARB-X, and even the NIH will fund some of these works if it's novel enough. So to do this smartly, to do trials which are smaller, to make it more cost effective, is possible for anti-infectives. In fact, if you look at the cost of an antibiotic development, it's actually far less than other drugs. You know, it's for cancer, you know, autoimmune diseases, cardiovascular, it's much more expensive. So if you have to talk about the cost of development, antibacterials are actually one of the lowest. So we've got to absolutely make that commitment and do it.
Thank you so much, Prabha. Very interesting. I'll pick your brains on this later. Rohit, please, your final remarks.
Well, just to note that, you know, even I think as we focus a lot on what I think a lot of people perceive as the failures of COVID-19 amongst the scientific successes, we do have a lot of models of success over the last few decades, and there's a lot to be drawn from that. I think Prabha said something very important in terms of the recognition of infections travel in all directions. So this recognition of the need for interconnectedness and the need for investing in different places. And the real key here, and this is again where coming at it from looking at the benefits of not-for-profits like GARDP and others is this recognition that we have to let go of just saying that there's only one approach to do this. If we're unwilling to let go of sort of just having this one approach, if we're not willing to use pragmatic approaches and using different approaches, we're not going to get to the goals we need until it's too late.
Thank you, Rohit. And as you mentioned, this model has also proven with DNDi and Medicine Small Malaria Venture and find that it works. It's very cost efficient, and you should use it. We should use it also for pandemic preparedness and for AMR.
Absolutely. We've had
I can see you want to say something.
Yeah, I apologize. We've had over 60 products emerge in the last 2 decades. It's reached over 2 billion people. So, you know, and this has been across a range of neglected tropical diseases and tuberculosis. So there's a lot of success to be seen in these models.
With that, thank you so much. Thank you, the 3 of you. This was really interesting. I hope that the audience shares this assessment, and I wish you a good evening or good day, depending on where you are. Thank you all for joining. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.